clearly the bird. But what if it's like the weird armadillo thing? It's a pangolin, and that's clearly not the flagship. But what if it was? It's not! Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, one of the main things that we all love about this series that keeps us coming back hunt after hunt is our adversaries, the monsters themselves. And there is one specific category of monsters that tends to get a bit more attention from people than others, and that is quite by design, an intentional thing. Because these are the flagship monsters. Usually one, sometimes more, monster chosen per each game, whose art is generally on the cover art for that game, and they are usually central either to the story or to the ecosystem of the region just as a whole. These also tend to be more on the fan favorite side of things. A lot of people's favorites happen to be flagships, and on top of that, they are monsters that tend to return to the games more often than others, as the devs seem to favor them when it comes to returning monster rosters. That said, there have been various ways that I have ranked the flagship monsters in the past, but not only do opinions change over time, and it's been a couple of years since the last time I've done this tier list, but also to spice things up, we're going to also include all the variations of every flagship too, with, the exception of Rathalos, because personally I think all Rathalos are within a very similar quality cluster, and if I was ranking every single one of the Rathalos, this video would be twice as long as it is. That said, let's go into flagship game release order and begin with Rathalos himself, who I've got starting off right in the middle at the B tier. Rathalos is a solid monster, relatively simple, sure, but well executed, classic dragon, and the main staple of the entire series, really. Regardless of your thoughts on the monster itself, it is undeniable that the Monster Hunter franchise would just be unrecognizable without him. Next up we have Azure Rathalos, and I'm putting him down in the D tier. He's for the most part just Rathalos but blue, and the actual differences to his fight where he flies around more, fires more fireballs from the sky, it just makes the fight more irritating, so anticlimactic, and not a fun monster to fight, so I put it down here. Then we have our Dose flagship of Kushala Daora, who I have in the B tier as well. This was a lot lower back in Iceborne times, but Rise and Sunbreak have done a lot to make Kushala Daora's fight more enjoyable, far more so, to the point that it now actively backs up the cool design of the creature too. I simply do like the things that are in the higher tiers more than him, honestly. Then for his variations, there's also Rusted Kushala Daora, who there is argument to be made is the actual flagship of Dose, and he's definitely a more interesting swap up than Azure Rathalos, but I do think that he does end up being just very similar to regular Kushala Daora, which is why he's in the tier that I have him here, with the exception of, he also hasn't been remade yet, so the only Rusted Kushala fight is still Old Style Kushala, which I just heavily dislike as an experience. Then we have Risen Kushala Daora on the far opposite side of the spectrum, our first S tier monster, and I absolutely adore Risen Kushala. The fight is far more interesting, it has a fun pace to it, it's more challenging, and he looks absolutely gorgeous too. After that, then we have Tigrex, who I've also decided to put on the B tier. I think Tigrex is a really solid monster, beloved by many of course, but I think relative to the general sentiment of liking him a lot, there's a sort of small amount of people who actually consider him their absolute favorite monster, and that's because he's sort of like another Rathalos in a way. He's much more detailed and sort of unique, sure, but he is just a dinosaur-like enemy whose main attack is constant charging back and forth and biting. He's not reinventing the wheel. The fight is iconic for the series, but it's also a classic fight archetype in this type of game. I just think that there are stronger concepts among the other flagships on the lineup. As for his variations then, Brute Tigrex also going in B tier. I like the Iceborne rework. I thought it was interesting, not necessarily better though than base Tigrex, but definitely different. Molten Tigrex, however, is going into the S tier. Visually stunning, he is massive, and I love massive monsters, and he has the same general fight type as Tigrex, full of charging, but now with an explosive touch all over it that makes it a lot more unique and engaging and sort of personal. Just an incredible monster. Then we have Grimclaw Tigrex, who I've got starting our A tier. I think he's better than the base Tigrex and Brute as well, but definitely not quite on the level of Molten, to put it simply. Then our next monster is Nargacuga, who I also have in the B tier. I know a lot of people like Nargacuga more than I do. I think it definitely appeals to a certain niche of people, but that niche is not me. Even with that said though, I still recognize that this is a well-designed monster for sure, and I definitely think that the fight is fun, so I think B is the right place for its base version, especially when we have Lucent Nargacuga up in the S tier. After all, especially with the 5th generation rework, it just got a real good glow up, an absolutely beautiful fight, fantastically paced and enjoyable experience, and then of course we also have Silverwind Nargacuga in the A tier too. Nargacuga, but with ranged attack using gusts of wind like blades, because it's just a grizzled old master. It's just such a fantastic concept for a deviant of the monster, and makes for a really cool fight too. Then of course we have the green Nargacuga down in B tier. I don't think it's that special. It has an extra tail combo, which is nice, and they worked into other Nargacuga's movesets later in the series, series, but I also don't think I can really say that this specific monster is actively worse than base Nergigante because of that, but it's also not even remotely going to be called better. After that, we move to 3rd generation, and we have Legionchris up in A tier, just a cut above the ones in B tier, in my opinion, as far as the creativity of design, while also sticking to that sort of classic Monster Hunter feel of being an almost actually believable creature too. And of course, just one of the most actually like flagship feeling flagships that we've ever had, being a big impressive underwater fight in the big impressive underwater game. Ivory Legionchris, his more landlocked cousin, I think is of similar statue, so also in A tier. I do prefer the concept of the underwater Legionchris, but I also think that Ivory looks visually cooler as an aesthetic to compensate that a bit. Then we have Abyssal Legionchris up in the S tier, just by far the absolute coolest of the three. Underwater, which I prefer, advanced moveset, and just visually so badass. Moving on, then we have Zinogre here, who I have in the A tier. I don't think it's necessarily more creative of a design than Tigrex or Nergigante. It's just a design that I personally prefer as someone who likes dogs and wolves and that type of thing. But then we have Stygian Zinogre up in the S tier. I just think it looks unbelievably cool. It's a great concept, a fun fight, all around deserving of the slot, especially with the rework that it got in Iceborne. Then we also have Thunderlord Zinogre in S tier, just a cool variation, again, of the color scheme and the powers that improves on the base monster too. After that, then we have Brachydios, whose base version I am, yes, actually going to put in S tier. For all the jokes about how much Josh loves Brachydios, I think it can get understated that I think he is genuinely also one of the best monsters in the series. I just don't quite adore him as much as Josh does, and with him being as vocal about it as he is, I don't feel the need to be that vocal about it myself, but I still definitely think he is an S tier monster, and that is a deserved spot. Raging Brachy, however, is our first S plus tier on this list, without a doubt, especially when you consider the Iceborne remake of the fight. An absolute masterpiece of Monster Hunter, in my opinion, the epitome of making a cinematic hunt in this series without having it feel too scripted or on rails, and I can only hope that it gets overtaken in the future, because that means that we've got another incredible fight if that happens. Following that, then into the 4th generation, we have Gore Magala up in A tier, definitely above average as a base flagship in my opinion. A lot of people adore this monster even more than I do, but it is without a doubt incredibly well designed, well executed, and integral to the whole concept of the story of the game from top to bottom, which is another side of the role of a flagship that earns some extra points. Then we have Chaotic Gore Magala in the S tier. I think it's just a heavily improved fight that doesn't lose any points that I would give to the regular Gore Magala either. Then we have Zregios, who I have up in the A tier. Again, I think this is just an above average monster design and a pretty fun fight as well, even if I do find Bleed as a sadist just a bit irritating in the moment of the actual fight. Moving on, then we have our full slate of the Fated 4 and the variations for Monster Hunter Generations, starting with Glavenus. I've actually put in the B tier. I know my opinion is not necessarily the common one on this one, but while I think Glavenus is cool as hell, I just think that he is a bit too much on the side of feels like a child coming up with a cool toy, rather than trying to come up with a creature that fits into the ecology of the world around it, with Legionchris being a good comparison, in my eyes, of a creature with at least as much cool factor, honestly, but just achieved in a much more fitting and believable way to the sort of series ethos. Then we have Hellblade Glavenus, also B tier for me, looks a bit cooler, but I don't find the fight more enjoyable than Blaze Glav, and it still has the same base issue. Then we also have Acidic Glavenus, who I actually have in the A tier, because I think it helps solve a lot of the lack of believability problem that I have with the other versions. Like, if Acidic Glavenus was the base version, I'd actually be fully on board. Just the idea of living in the Vale, this area with all these bodies and all these chemicals around, getting his tail covered in sulfur, which then covers an edge that is just sort of sharp by default, but also because it's being protected by the sulfur, it stays sharp, and then when he grinds the sulfur off of the edge, it makes it even sharper, and then of course the defense down that he gives you is just a result of those same chemicals being on the blade when he cuts you with it. It's just sort of way more ecologically sound in my mind, and much more cool as a result to me too. After that is Mizutsune, the Bubble Fox, and of course up in the S tier for me, even as a base monster. I love the flow of this fight, it's unique, it has a debuff that no other monster has, outside of its variations of course, it's pink, and it has a ton of silly aspects to it too, while also being undeniably beautiful, menacing, and, well, again, ecologically sound, which I think matters more to me than it might have once did when I first started playing the game. As for its variations, Soulseer is also going into S tier for me. I think it's fun, but I don't think it's outright better, and then Violet Mizutsune is again going S tier. I think the fight is better, but I prefer the visuals of base Mizutsune, and a lot of why I like base Mizutsune is the sort of tranquil feeling of fighting against a monster who basically just has a paintbrush for a tail and is just blowing bubbles at you, and that changes a lot when the bubbles are made of gasoline and then lit on fire. I don't think it makes it a worse monster than base Mizutsune by any means, but in my personal opinion, they're probably around the same level. Then we have Astalos right into the A tier, above average for sure, visually extremely cool. The music for this fight is unforgettably incredible, and then the fight is also very good, but weirdly, it's the part that I think about the least when I think about base Astalos. As for Bolt Reaver though, he gets into S tier because I do remember remember a lot of the fight a lot more than base Astalos, and he still has great music and arguably even cooler visuals too. Following that then we have Gammoth, of course, who is sadly going to be going into the C tier. I love Gammoth conceptually, but the old fight was just a really sour spot. Just not really fun, not really impactful or memorable aside from the memory of looking at her legs while he just slashed repeatedly and endlessly. Elder Frost is going in the same spot for the same reasons, honestly. The concept and visuals of the monsters are easily enough to just keep them out of the D tier, but the fight is a big letdown that I severely hope gets remade in Wilds. They need to take another stab at this to get it properly done, because a monster this big in an environment that is properly fitting to it could absolutely be designed in a way that is really impactful. Make them actually cause like an avalanche in a proper snow physics area. You can have it have a more larger open type of game around it that would really actually give you the opportunity to do more unique things like that. Moving out from that, then we have Velstrax, who is of course in the A tier. Just a really badass monster, a favorite of many people, but while a lot of people tend to suspend their disbelief for him because he is just that cool, I still personally struggle to view him as an actual part of an ecosystem rather than just like a lab rat, a creature created by a mad scientist or something like that. And while I still do think that he is an incredible monster, I just don't think he's as good as some others do. Crimson Glow, however, does make it into S tier regardless of that, as it just hits perfectly in pretty much every other possible area of what makes a monster good. Great visuals, great fight, great music, just all fantastic. And then Risen Crimson Glow is more challenging, but I don't think I would necessarily label it as outright better than Crimson Glow, so I'm again going with S tier for that. I just don't think it quite reaches S+ tier for me. That said, there is one more 4th generation flagship technically speaking, which is Bloodbath Diablos, who is going right onto the S tier. Fantastic monster, great fight, incredibly challenging, great variation of a good monster. That said, I won't be going over his variations because, well, he is the variation to begin with. Then let's move on to the 5th generation with Nergigante up in the S+ tier. Yep, I just consider this to be hard to argue against, really, honestly. Not only was he the flagship of the game that brought most hunters to the game in the first place and to the series, so arguably he was the most successful as his role in the flagship of drawing in new players, but also he was just the absolute perfect learnable fight for those players behind a badass looking creature with terrifyingly epic moments in his moveset too, that made him just the perfect monster for the game that had the surge in new players. And I just consider him a near perfect monster that also happened at the near perfect time for him. We do also have Runer Nergigante too, but I do have him down in the A tier. He loses some of the context that made base Nergigante great, really, for me. I think he is also less actually learnable in the same way, and generally I just also prefer the natural like bony spikes of regular Nergigante to the metal ones of Runer, going back to my feelings about monsters being ecologically sound and things like that. After that though, we have Velkhana down in the B tier. Solid monster, sure, beautiful creature, fight causes a lot of irritation for me, especially just the part where her ice beam will go through her ice wall. I've said it before, and I will say it again and again every time the monster comes up. If the wall blocks player movement, it should also block physical attacks from the monster. It is a physical object, and that should be universal, that should be permanent, that should be consistent for everything. Then we have Magnamalo, who I have in the B tier as well. Very cool monster, above average fight, and while I have learned the technical researcher notes about Magnamalo, I still do struggle to actually see him as making ecological sense. He's just too both sleek and spiny. He almost like, it feels like he's a bit too stylized to be in a natural creature, I guess. Scorned Magnamalo I actually have on the same tier. I think it's cooler for sure, but the arm blades are also somewhat comical to me, and I don't think it's an outright improvement over the base monster. Then we have Espinas, the flagship of Frontier, but also added to the main series in Sunbreak, and this monster is in the A tier for me. I think it is similar to a Rathlo style creature as far as base design concepts, but it gets some bump ups from starting fights asleep, from the general thorny design that I quite like, and just being a pretty interesting creature to begin with. There's also then Flaming Espinas, who I have in the S tier, just a pure improvement over the base monster in my eyes, a very enjoyable encounter, and Sunbreak just did Espinas quite nicely all around. And our final section here, we have Malzeno in the S tier, and this compared to Magnamalo, I feel like is taking a theme or concept and stylizing a monster around it without getting quite too lost in the sauce with it. Like Malzeno is sleek, he is trimmed down, but he does feel like a monster that is possible given the other monsters in the universe, and he does also, to be fair, have the advantage of being an Elder Dragon, which tends to require a bit less explaining. His fight is really cool and fast-paced as well, just a really solid monster all around on every level as far as I'm concerned, and absolutely massively important to the story of the expansion too. But then finally is Primordial Malzeno, and this one is up in the S+ tier to round it out, probably surprising no one. This is just Malzeno but improved tenfold, one of the most climactic experiences in the entire series for sure. It does teeter a bit on the edge of believable or not as a creature, but it is definitely close enough to that line that I don't have any issues at all. This for me is what Velstrax is for a lot of people, where it's so cool that that it just sort of pushes it slightly over that suspension of disbelief line and makes me actually accept it. And that just about does it for today then, everyone. Just a full tier list of all the flagships and their variations, except for the Rathalos ones, because again, that would basically just be its own list added on to the video itself. I hope you've enjoyed this generally, and of course let me know your own thoughts down below. What you think I got right, or maybe even what I got wrong. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.